There are houses that shine and houses that hide. The Beaumont mansion did both. Its walls gleamed with mirrors and chandeliers, but behind the glass there lived a kind of silence that could not be cleaned away, not even by the most devoted hands. Maria knew that silence well. Every morning, before the first light of dawn touched the tall iron gates, she would arrive with her worn shoes, her blue uniform pressed, her heart steady but never light. The mansion was her workplace, and also her test. She was 26, maybe 27. No one cared to ask. Her hands were strong, her back familiar with the weight of other people's wealth. Yet there was something in her eyes, a gentleness that did not belong in a world of gold and marble. Inside, the house waited for her like a sleeping beast. The floor gleamed, the portraits stared, the air smelled of lilies and money. Maria opened the windows one by one, and with every curtain drawn, she whispered a silent prayer. Not for herself, but for the little boy upstairs. His name was Daniel, 6 years old, quiet, always watching. He had the look of a child who had learned too early that love could vanish when you needed it most. His mother, Eleanor Beaumont, was the kind of woman the city admired and feared at once. She walked as if gravity obeyed her. Everything she touched became immaculate, except the people around her. To her, kindness was weakness, and tears were mistakes to be punished. Maria had learned to survive her moods. She cleaned the hallways with the precision of a soldier, polished the silver until she could see her own reflection, not to admire herself, but to remember she was still there. But that morning, something was different. The house was too quiet, even for them. The boy hadn't come down for breakfast. Eleanor hadn't shouted yet, and Maria, with her bucket and cloth, felt the strange pulse of unease inside her chest. When she passed the door of the child's room, she heard it. A sound too fragile to ignore. Not crying, not quite sobbing, a whisper of sadness. She paused. Her instincts told her to keep walking. Servants didn't open doors. They obeyed. But her heart, her human heart, pushed her hand toward the handle. Inside, the curtains were drawn. The room was a world of shadows and soft toys, and there, by the window, the boy sat motionless, holding a small red swing from the garden in his hands, a piece of rope and wood, broken. He stared at it, like someone who had lost a friend. Maria didn't speak. She didn't dare. She simply knelt beside him, and the silence between them became something sacred. In that silence, he finally breathed, slow, trembling, alive. The air changed. Even the dust seemed to float differently. There, in that quiet corner of a golden prison, a seed of something pure began to grow. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't defiance. It was compassion. The rarest thing inside that house. Downstairs, the sound of heels struck marble. Eleanor was awake. Her presence filled every corridor like perfume and thunder. She expected perfection, not just from the house, but from the universe itself. To her, servants were shadows. They moved, they cleaned, they vanished when not needed. As she entered the dining hall, her eyes scanned every detail with surgical precision. The napkins folded, the flowers scented, the light perfectly balanced. Everything was right, everything but her life. And yet she would never admit that emptiness, the hollow ache that even gold could not fill. At that very moment upstairs, Maria placed the broken swing gently on the boy's shelf. The red paint had faded, but in the light it still looked alive. The boy looked at her, his eyes fragile, trusting, and for a heartbeat she forgot her place. She smiled, just a small human smile, and enough to say, "I see you." She didn't notice that from the hallway. Another pair of eyes had seen her too, cold, polished, merciless eyes. Eleanor's. In every story there is a moment when the truth begins to wake. It doesn't come with thunder or tears. It comes quietly, through the eyes of a child and the heart of someone humble enough to listen. But in the Beaumont mansion, truth was the most dangerous guest of all. And that morning, as light spilled across the marble floors, something had already begun to change, something that no amount of power or cruelty could stop, because compassion, once born, never dies quietly. Eleanor did not need to raise her voice, to make her anger known. Her silence was sharper than any word. She stood in the doorway, watching the maid beside her son, her shadow stretching long and thin across the floor. To her, this scene was not tender. It was rebellion. A servant kneeling beside her child, daring to exist in the same light. It was enough to ignite every hidden fury she carried. Maria rose quickly, clutching the cleaning cloth to her chest, her face pale, her heart pounding in the soft stillness of the room. The child looked up at his mother, unaware of the storm that was about to begin. Eleanor's heels echoed on the floor as she entered. Her perfume filled the air, thick and suffocating. She adjusted a bracelet on her wrist, slow, deliberate, like a ritual of control. Nothing about her face moved, except the corners of her mouth tightening slightly. Without a word, she took the broken swing from the shelf and turned it in her hand, her eyes cold on the red paint that had faded with time. Then she placed it back down, not gently, not violently, just carelessly, the way one returns an object that means nothing. She turned toward the window and spoke at last, her voice low, heavy, measured. "The room is dusty again," she said. "I thought you cleaned it yesterday." Maria's lips parted, but no sound came. She wanted to explain that she had, that she cleaned this house until her fingers bled, but she knew how this worked. Truth was not welcome here unless it came from above. So she lowered her head. "Yes, madam," she said softly. Eleanor walked closer, her steps slow and deliberate, the rhythm of superiority. She passed her fingers along the window frame, looking at the faint dust she found there, and smiled, not from amusement, but from power. She wanted the woman beside her to feel small, to remember. "It's always the same," she murmured. "You people come in here thinking that if you smile enough, if you act kind enough, you'll be seen. But you won't." Her words cut through the air like glass. "This is a house of standards, not pity." Maria kept her gaze low, but in her chest something began to shift. Not defiance, not pride, only the ache of being unseen for too long. Behind her, Daniel watched, his small hands trembling at his sides. He didn't understand cruelty yet, but he recognized injustice when he saw it. Eleanor's eyes caught his reflection in the mirror, and she turned, annoyed. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she said to her own child, her tone now sharp. Enough to wound. The boy didn't answer. He only moved closer to Maria, his tiny hand brushing against the fabric of her skirt. It was instinct, pure, innocent, dangerous. That single gesture, the smallest act of love, burned through Eleanor like a spark. She took a step forward. "Daniel," she said, "go downstairs." He didn't move. Her voice grew colder. "Now." He looked at Maria, then back at his mother, torn between fear and loyalty. Maria whispered softly, almost inaudibly, "It's all right. Go." He hesitated one more second, then obeyed, his small steps echoing down the hallway until the sound disappeared. Eleanor and Maria stood alone now. The distance between them felt enormous. One woman framed by silken mirrors, the other by humility and silence. Eleanor spoke first. "You've grown comfortable here." Her tone was slow, dangerous, perhaps too comfortable. It's easy to forget your place when people start treating you kindly. She walked past her, her hand brushing against the maid's shoulder as if to erase her presence. But don't confuse kindness with equality. Maria stood perfectly still. She didn't defend herself. She didn't cry. She just let the words pass through her like cold wind through glass. The truth was, she didn't need to fight. Somewhere deep down she knew that the things Eleanor feared most were not disobedience or mistakes, but goodness itself. Outside, the morning sun reached the windows, filling the room with a strange, soft light. It fell across Maria's face, and for the briefest moment it looked as if the light itself had chosen sides. Before leaving, Eleanor turned once more, her eyes scanning the room, the floor, the woman before her. "Remember," she said, her tone final, "you're here to clean, not to comfort." Then she left. The sound of her heels faded down the marble stairs, leaving only silence behind. Maria stood by the window for a long time, staring at the broken swing on the shelf. Dust particles floated in the sunlight, dancing softly in the air. She didn't cry. She simply pressed her hand against her chest, where her heart still trembled. Down in the garden, Daniel sat alone on the red swing, pushing himself gently, his small legs not strong enough to move it far. The ropes creaked softly. The world around him was too big, too quiet, too beautiful for a child who felt unloved. From the window, Maria watched him, and her lips moved silently, a prayer not of words, but of hope. Because in a world like this, hope was her only rebellion. Before we dive deeper into this story that feels almost too real to be fiction, let me ask you something with care. If stories that touch the heart mean something to you, subscribe now and leave your like. This small gesture keeps this work alive and helps these stories reach more souls. Thank you, from the heart. Now breathe deeply and come with me. Night fell like a curtain of velvet over the Beaumont mansion. The windows glowed faintly from inside, soft light, spilling into the garden where the red swing barely moved. The house, so proud and golden in daylight, became something else after sunset. Quiet, enormous, and afraid of its own echo. Inside, every step sounded too loud. The hallways stretched long and hollow, mirrors reflecting only emptiness. The chandelier in the dining room swayed slightly, its crystals whispering secrets to no one. Maria moved silently through those corridors, a cloth in her hands, her thoughts far from the silver and glass she was supposed to care for. Each room she entered smelled of wealth and loneliness. The walls were heavy with portraits of ancestors who smiled without warmth. She had seen these faces 1,000 times, but that night they seemed to stare at her differently, not with pride, but with question. The house was sleeping, except for one small soul who never truly rested. In the room upstairs, the boy turned in his bed, unable to find peace. He pressed the pillow tight against his chest, listening to the faint voices that floated from below, voices of grown-ups that carried no love. There were words sharp enough to hurt even when you didn't understand them. Maria paused by the base of the stairs, her instincts drawing her upward. She hesitated. Servants didn't wander at night. They finished their duties and disappeared. But something called her. Not sound, not fear. Something invisible, like the pull of a truth that refuses to be ignored. She climbed the stairs, one careful step after another, the wood creaking softly beneath her shoes. At the top, she saw the faint glow of light under a door. The child's room. She stood there for a long moment, her hand resting on the handle, afraid that even kindness could become a crime in this place. But then she heard it again, that small, trembling sound, the sound of a child trying not to cry. She opened the door just enough to see him curled up, his face hidden in the pillow. The moonlight slipped through the curtains, silvering his hair. The broken swing still sat on the shelf, casting its shadow across the floor. Maria entered quietly, her steps soft as breath. She sat on the edge of his bed, careful not to startle him. The boy didn't move, but his voice broke the silence, barely a whisper. "She said I shouldn't talk to you." Maria's heart tightened. She didn't answer. She only looked at him, a child too small to understand cruelty, too old to ignore it. His tiny hands clutched the blanket as though trying to hold on to something safe. "She said you'll make me forget who I am," he murmured. Maria's gaze softened. She reached out and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. Her hand trembled slightly. "Then remember this," she thought silently, though no word escaped her lips. "You are loved, even when someone forgets to show it." He turned toward her slowly, his eyes wet, his voice fading into sleep. She stayed there until his breathing grew steady, watching the peace return to his small face, even if just for a moment. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing the branches against the window. Somewhere far off, thunder murmured, a promise of rain. Downstairs, a door slammed. Eleanor's heels echoed once, twice, sharp as strikes. Maria froze. She had stayed too long. The light under the boy's door flickered as Eleanor's shadow appeared in the hallway. The maid stood quickly, her heart pounding. She stepped back from the bed, smoothing her apron, forcing her hands to be still. The door opened without a knock. Eleanor stood there, her robe tied tightly, her eyes like ice. Behind her, the house seemed to hold its breath. Maria bowed her head, her voice low. He couldn't sleep. Eleanor's tone came cold and flat. "You're not his mother." The words fell heavy in the room, louder than thunder, more final than a scream. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, without another word, Eleanor turned and left, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air like a ghost. Maria remained, still for a while, staring at the door. The boy had not woken. His small hand rested over his heart. She placed the blanket gently over him again, her fingers brushing the stuffed rabbit beside him. Then she walked out, closing the door quietly behind her. Downstairs, rain began to fall. It hit the glass windows softly, like the world itself whispering a secret. The mansion exhaled, its golden halls dimmed to grey, and in that fragile silence, something invisible began to take root, a truth so pure it frightened even the darkness. Because sometimes it is not the scream that changes a house, but the whisper. The rain did not stop through the night. It came softly at first, then harder, as though the sky had decided to cleanse the earth of something unseen. The sound filled every room of the mansion, slipping through cracks, dripping down the windows, echoing through the marble halls like a quiet confession. By dawn, the garden was soaked. The red swing hung motionless, dripping with silver droplets. Its ropes trembled each time the wind passed, as if the air itself remembered what had been broken. Inside, the world stirred. The servants began their day, moving carefully under the watch of unspoken tension. No one dared to speak of what they had heard the night before. The argument, the door, the voices, but everyone felt it. The mansion felt heavier, as if the rain outside had found a way in. Maria rose early, her eyes tired but steady. She walked into the kitchen, the scent of coffee and cold air greeting her. She worked in silence, her body moving on instinct, cleaning, polishing, preparing. Yet every sound reminded her of something she could not forget. The sharpness in Eleanor's voice, the way the woman's shadow had stretched across the child's bed like a dark omen. When the family gathered for breakfast, Maria stood at a distance, hands folded, eyes down. Eleanor sat at the end of the long table, flawless even in the grey light, her red dress glowing, faintly like defiance against the morning. Daniel sat beside her, quiet, a spoon untouched before him. The air between them was not air at all, it was distance. Mr. Beaumont sat at the other end, reading his newspaper as if the printed words could hide the truth in his own home. But even he glanced occasionally toward the boy, as though something inside him already knew. Maria refilled the coffee, her movements invisible, her steps rehearsed. She had learned to live as a shadow, but that morning, even her silence drew eyes. Eleanor's gaze followed her, slow, calculating, cruelly calm. There was something about Maria's stillness that enraged her, something about her quiet strength, the way she carried pain without complaint. To Eleanor, it was a reflection she could not bear, a mirror showing what she lacked. The knife scraped against porcelain as Eleanor's hand trembled slightly, but she hid it behind a cold smile. She called for Maria to fix the centerpiece, even though it was already perfect. Maria obeyed. She reached for the vase in the middle of the table, a bouquet of lilies, white and flawless. As she adjusted the flowers, her sleeve brushed against a crystal glass. It tipped. The sound was soft, almost delicate. yet it shattered the air like thunder. The glass fell and broke at Eleanor's feet. The room froze. For a moment, no one moved. The rain outside beat harder against the windows. Maria bent down immediately, whispering apologies that no one would hear. She gathered the pieces with her bare hands, small cuts blooming across her fingers. Drops of red mingled with the white marble floor. She didn't flinch. She didn't stop. Eleanor watched her closely, eyes narrowed, voice sharp but steady. "Careless hands," she said, her tone too calm to be kind. "Always the same." Maria bowed her head, the blood slipping quietly between her fingers. She gathered the last shard and rose to leave, but Eleanor's voice stopped her. "You'll clean the garden?" "After this," she said. "Even if it rains, especially if it rains." Maria paused only for a moment, then nodded. No argument, no question, just obedience, the only language that kept her safe. Outside, the garden was soaked to the roots. Mud clung to her shoes, the smell of wet earth filled her lungs. The rain fell on her shoulders, her face, her wounded hands. Each drop stung, but she kept working. She scrubbed the benches, swept the leaves, cleaned the paths. She even wiped the red swing, though it no longer swung. From the window above, Daniel watched her, his small hand pressed against the glass, his breath fogging the cold pain. He didn't understand why kindness was punished, but he understood pain, the kind that didn't make a sound. Inside, Eleanor sipped her coffee, pretending not to notice. But something in her chest ached as she looked out at the woman working in the rain. She would never admit it, but what she felt was not power. It was envy. Envy of a soul still, capable of grace after so much cruelty. The rain fell harder, the sky darkened again, yet Maria did not stop. Each movement was a quiet act of resistance, her body soaked, her spirit unbroken. The more the world tried to humiliate her, the more she became light inside the storm. When the morning ended, she stood at the gate for a moment, her hands trembling, her heart heavy. But somewhere behind her, she heard a sound, a small voice calling her name. She turned and saw Daniel, running barefoot, through the rain, holding something in his hands. It was a flower, a single red rose he had taken from the table. He offered it to her, his hair wet, his eyes bright. She didn't speak. She only knelt and took it gently, the way you hold a fragile truth. And for a second, even the rain seemed to stop, because sometimes the smallest gesture is enough to save a soul. The rain had softened, but the world still smelled of thunder. The clouds hung low, heavy and silver, and every drop that clung to the roses felt like it carried the memory of what had just happened. Maria remained in the garden, her uniform clinging to her skin, her hands raw from work and water. The red rose Daniel had given her rested gently against her palm, its stem trembling with each gust of wind. Inside, the house had fallen into uneasy quiet, but one window remained awake. Behind the glass, Eleanor stood, motionless, watching. She had seen everything, the child running barefoot, the rose, the touch between servant and son. To anyone else, it would have been a tender image. To her, it was betrayal. Her heart did not see kindness. It saw intrusion. The woman outside was not a caregiver in her eyes. She was an intruder in the perfect image of her family. And the boy's innocent act of love felt, to her, like disobedience. Eleanor's jaw tightened. The reflection in the window showed her face, beautiful, composed, and utterly alone. She told herself it was discipline. She told herself she was protecting her son from weakness. But what she truly feared was something else, the thought that love could exist in her house without her permission. When Maria came back inside, dripping and cold, the floor beneath her feet echoed faintly. She walked toward the servants' wing, hoping to dry her clothes before starting the afternoon chores. But as she reached the corridor, she saw Eleanor waiting. The woman stood near the grand staircase, framed by the pale morning light. Her posture was perfect, her arms crossed loosely, her expression unreadable. Maria slowed her steps, lowering her gaze out of habit. She knew what that silence meant, the kind of silence that comes before a storm, the silence that hurts more than shouting ever could. Eleanor spoke softly, her voice measured and slow. "The flowers are ruined," she said. "The garden is a mess, and my son is sick from running in the rain." Maria's hands trembled slightly, though she held them tight behind her back. She wanted to explain, to say that the boy had acted out of love, that she had not called him. But she also knew the truth. No reason would ever matter to someone who had already decided to blame her. Eleanor began to walk in slow circles, her heels clicking on the marble like a metronome. "I have tolerated many things in this house," she said, her tone smooth, almost tender. "But I cannot tolerate manipulation." Maria lifted her eyes for the first time. There was no anger there, only quiet disbelief. Eleanor stopped in front of her. Her eyes gleamed sharp and cold. "Do you think kindness makes you safe? That the boy's affection will protect you?" Her lips curved slightly. "It won't. It will only remind him you don't belong here." The words sank deep, cold as rain. Eleanor turned her head toward the stairs where the servants had gathered quietly, pretending to work, but watching. She raised her voice, calm but loud enough to reach them. "From now on," she said, "this house will have order again. There will be no more confusion about who serves and who commands." Her eyes returned to Maria. "I want you to understand that clearly." The hallway went silent. Maria nodded once, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, madam." But Eleanor was not done. She gestured toward the wet floor near the entrance. "Clean that, all of it. On your knees." Maria hesitated for a moment. It was not pride that stopped her. It was the realization that she was no longer being corrected, but humiliated. The line between duty and cruelty had vanished. She knelt slowly, her wet skirt clinging to her legs. Her fingers touched the cold marble, tracing the puddles of rain left by her own footprints. She cleaned in silence, each motion deliberate, controlled, almost reverent, as if she was not washing a floor, but cleansing herself of something darker. Above her, Eleanor watched. There was no satisfaction in her eyes, only emptiness, the kind of emptiness that feeds itself on control. Around them, the servants pretended not to see, but every heart in that house felt the weight of what was happening. Maria finished her task. She stood slowly, her knees aching, her palms raw. She placed the cloth back in the bucket and turned toward the door. Her steps were slow but steady. She did not look back. Eleanor's voice followed her, quiet and cutting. "Remember your place." Outside, the rain had stopped. The garden shimmered under weak sunlight. The red swing glistened, drops of water falling like tears from its seat. Daniel stood near it, holding the stuffed rabbit close, his small face pale with confusion. He didn't understand why goodness was punished, why warmth was turned into shame. But somewhere deep inside, something in him shifted. Children remember what they see, even when no one thinks they're watching. And that morning, as his mother's reflection moved behind the window and the maid disappeared into the rain, the boy's heart began to learn a truth that no one had meant to teach him. That power, without love, is just another form of loneliness. That night the mansion seemed to breathe differently. The rain had gone, but it had left a trace, not just in the garden or the marble floors, but in the hearts of those who lived inside. The air smelled of damp stone and regret. The chandeliers shimmered faintly, catching small reflections of light, as though they were trying to remind the house of its former beauty. But beauty could not hide what lingered in the silence. Maria sat alone in the bow. Servants' quarters, her hands red and swollen. A faint cut marked her palm, the same one that had bled earlier that day. She stared at it for a long time, not as a wound, but as proof that she was still alive. Pain had a strange way of reminding her of her place in the world, invisible but enduring. The other servants whispered nearby, careful not to speak too loud. They pitied her, but no one dared to show it. In houses like this, compassion was dangerous. A single kind word could cost a life. Of stability, And yet, in their silence, Maria felt their quiet sorrow. She wasn't angry, she was only tired. The wind passed through the corridors, making the curtains move like ghosts. Somewhere upstairs a clock struck 11. The house was vast, but every sound carried, footsteps, whispers, even the faint cry of a child behind a closed door. Maria looked up. She had grown used to those sounds. But tonight, something in the air felt different. There was a tension, not the usual chill of order and fear, but something heavier, a storm without thunder. In his room, Daniel lay awake again. He had tried to sleep, but the images from the day would not leave him. His mother's sharp words, the sight of Maria on her knees, the way everyone had pretended not to see. He pressed the stuffed rabbit to his chest and turned toward the window. Outside, the garden glowed under the moonlight. The red swing moved gently, as if someone invisible was sitting on it. He closed his eyes and whispered, a prayer he didn't know how to finish. In another part of the house, Eleanor stood by the mirror, brushing her hair with the precision of a soldier cleaning a weapon. Her reflection stared back at her, flawless and cold. But deep behind the surface, a flicker of something unfamiliar began to show. Doubt. She ignored it, as she always did, but it lingered like a whisper. Power could control everything, except the heart. She set the brush down and looked toward the window. In the reflection, she saw something she didn't expect, her son's room light still on. She hesitated, her expression unreadable. Then she turned away, blowing out the candle. Downstairs, Maria sat with a small notebook in her hands. She didn't write, she never did. She couldn't read the words, but she liked the way the pages felt beneath her fingers. It made her feel like the world still held stories worth touching. Her eyes closed for a moment. She thought of her mother, of another small house far away where kindness still meant something. She thought of Daniel, the way he had offered her the rose, the way his hands had trembled, but not from fear, from love. That memory was the only warmth she had left. When she finally lay down to rest, the candle flickered beside her bed, casting long shadows across the wall. One of them looked almost like a child holding a flower. She watched it dance until sleep came, and while she dreamed, the mansion continued to hum its soft, restless song. Somewhere in its vast halls, an old piano played a single note as the wind passed through the keys. The sound was faint but real, a haunting melody that seemed to come from the heart of the house itself. By morning, nothing would look different. The floors would shine, the mirrors would gleam, the table would be set perfectly again. But something invisible had already shifted. The boy upstairs had stopped believing that silence was safety. The woman in the servants' room had started to believe that dignity could survive humiliation, and the mistress of the house, she had begun to feel the first crack in the armor she had built around her heart. In that mansion of mirrors and lies, truth had begun to breathe, quietly, patiently, because no matter how strong the walls, the human heart always finds a way to make itself heard. Morning came softly, wrapped in mist. The storm had passed, but its echo remained in the stillness of the house. Every room seemed to hold its breath. The scent of wet soil drifted in from the garden, carrying the faint perfume of lilies and mud. It was a peaceful morning on the surface, but peace in that mansion was only another form of disguise. Maria began her routine as always. The uniform clean, the shoes quiet, the heart steady. But something inside her had changed. She no longer moved like a shadow. She moved like someone who had seen too much light to return fully to darkness. Her eyes lingered on small things, a petal fallen from a vase, the marks of small hands on the glass, details that others ignored, but to her meant everything. In the dining hall, Eleanor sipped her coffee slowly. She stared through the window at the red swing outside, its ropes glistening under the pale light. For the first time, she did not feel power watching it. She felt unease. The image of her son running barefoot through the rain refused to fade. It had replayed in her mind through the night, looping endlessly until it no longer felt like a child's mischief, but something deeper, something pure, something that shamed her. She pushed the thought away and adjusted her rings. Pride was easier than reflection. Across the table, Mr. Beaumont read the newspaper in silence. His eyes moved over the words, but he wasn't truly reading. He had noticed the change, too. The boy had become distant. The laughter that once echoed through the halls had vanished. He heard small things, the closing of a door, the creak of the swing, the quiet footsteps upstairs at dawn, and each sound felt like the house trying to speak to him. He glanced toward the staircase where Daniel usually appeared for breakfast, but the boy didn't come. Instead, he heard faint movement from above, the sound of drawers opening, toys being moved, a soft humming that stopped and started again. Eleanor pretended not to notice. She continued to stir her coffee, her hand perfectly steady. Maria passed quietly behind her, carrying a tray of bread and fruit. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the room, a simple human warmth that didn't belong to the world of chandeliers and porcelain. She placed it on the table with care, her presence barely acknowledged. Yet for a brief moment Mr. Beaumont's eyes lifted to hers. It wasn't gratitude, not quite. It was recognition, the kind that said, "I see what others choose not to." It lasted only a second before Eleanor's voice broke the silence. "He'll come down when he's ready," she said, though no one had asked. Her tone carried the same precision as always, but it was thinner now, as if she were holding something fragile beneath it. Maria bowed her head and left the room, her steps fading down the corridor. Upstairs, the boy sat on his bed, staring at the window. The sunlight made patterns on the floor, moving like water. He traced them with his fingers, pretending they were paths leading somewhere better. On the shelf, the broken swing sat beside the stuffed rabbit, both small, silent witnesses of everything that had been lost. He whispered something to himself, though even he didn't know what it meant. A thought, maybe. A promise. Later that day, the boy wandered into the garden. The air was heavy with the smell of earth, the grass still wet, soft beneath his bare feet. He stopped by the red swing, brushing his hand along the rope as if greeting an old friend. He pushed it gently, watching it sway, slow and uneven. Then he sat, small hands gripping the rope, the seat creaking beneath his weight. From one of the upstairs windows, Maria saw him. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside. Her shoes sank slightly into the damp soil as she crossed the garden. She didn't speak. She simply stood nearby, close enough for him to feel her presence, far enough not to disturb the fragile peace that had settled around him. The boy's face was calm, but his eyes were full of thoughts too heavy for his age. He looked toward the sky, where clouds drifted like silent ghosts. The wind touched his hair. The sound of water dripped from the roses, each drop catching the sunlight before falling to the ground. Maria watched him, her heart quiet. She knew this stillness wouldn't last. In houses built on pride, moments of peace were only pauses between storms. Inside, Eleanor watched from the window again, but this time her anger did not rise. Her heart hesitated, caught between fear and something she didn't recognize. Guilt. The sight of them together, the woman and the child, the servant and the heir, struck her with a kind of sadness she didn't know how to name. She turned away from the window and pressed her hand to her chest. For the first time she wondered what her son saw when he looked at her. Did he see a mother or a stranger living behind beautiful walls? In that moment her reflection in the glass looked back at her, and she could no longer tell which one was real. Down in the garden, the boy leaned forward on the swing, his feet brushing the grass. Maria stood still, her eyes following him. The wind carried the faint sound of the ropes creaking, a sound that seemed to echo far beyond the garden. A small, fragile melody, almost like forgiveness trying to find its way into the air. And as the light shifted over the house, Something invisible began to change again. The mansion, once proud and still, began to breathe differently, softer, slower, more human, because even in the most silent places, love finds its way back, not with noise, but with presence. Days passed in quiet repetition. The mansion followed its rituals like a body too afraid to stop breathing. Breakfast at 8, silence at 9, perfection at 10. But beneath that rhythm, something had broken. Not loudly, not visibly, but enough for everyone to feel it. Eleanor continued her life as she always had, wrapped in silk and order. She hosted lunches that looked beautiful but sounded hollow, smiled for guests who no longer came as often, and moved through her own home as if rehearsing a role she didn't believe in anymore. Her beauty had become armor, her voice a command, yet each command echoed longer than before, as though even the walls hesitated to obey. Mr. Beaumont watched quietly. He had spent years learning how to keep peace by pretending not to notice. It was easier that way, to stay in the safety of indifference. But indifference has a way of turning into guilt, and guilt, once awake, does not go back to sleep. He noticed how Daniel no longer ran when his mother entered the room, how his laughter had shrunk to a whisper, how he avoided the sound of her heels on the floor. He noticed the small things, a plate left untouched, a toy left on the stairs, a swing that swayed without wind. And he noticed Maria, not because she was visible, but because she was constant. The house might change moods, storms might come and go, but her presence never wavered. She worked quietly, almost invisibly, yet the house felt less cruel when she was near. The boy followed her with his eyes, not because she was kind to him, though she was, but because she saw him, truly saw him. It was that kind of seeing that frightened Eleanor most. One afternoon, the light fell through the high windows in soft golden lines. The boy sat in the corner of the library, his small hands flipping through a book he couldn't yet read. Maria was dusting the shelves nearby, careful not to disturb the silence. The sound of a distant piano came faintly from the parlor, a melody someone had left unfinished. Mr. Beaumont entered quietly, his steps slow, thoughtful. He stood in the doorway for a moment, observing. The boy looked peaceful again, the kind of peace that never came when his mother was near. It wasn't rebellion, it was survival. He watched Maria as she reached for a book on the top shelf, her hand trembling slightly from fatigue. Her movements were graceful in their simplicity, no vanity, no performance, only care. When she placed the book back, she turned and met his gaze briefly. There was no fear in her eyes, only weariness, the quiet endurance of someone who had long accepted that goodness rarely wins quickly. He nodded slightly, almost in respect, then turned his attention to his son. Daniel smiled faintly, his fingers tracing the drawings inside the book. There was a light in his eyes that the father hadn't seen in months. For a fleeting moment, he remembered the days before the silence, the laughter that used to echo down the corridors, the small arms that would reach for him when he returned from work, the way Eleanor's voice had once been soft. That memory felt like another lifetime. He left the room quietly, but the image stayed with him. The boy's half smile, the maid's calm presence, the sunlight cutting through the dust. For the first time, the thought that had always been forbidden found its way into his mind. Maybe the wrong person was being blamed. That night, he didn't sleep. He lay awake beside his wife, listening to the rhythm of her breathing. It was steady, elegant, controlled, the same rhythm she used to govern everything around her. He turned his head slightly, watching her face illuminated by the moonlight. Beautiful, yes, but beauty meant nothing when it had no warmth. He thought of Daniel again. The boy's silence was not just sadness, it was protest, the kind that children carry in their eyes when they've run out of words. Outside, the wind stirred, the red swing creaked in the darkness. The garden, soaked from days of rain, shimmered faintly in the moonlight. The air felt heavy with something unspoken. the kind of truth that waits patiently to be seen. Maria was awake too, sitting by her window in the servants' quarters. The night breeze moved the curtain gently, brushing against her face. She could see the garden from there, the faint outline of the swing, the light from the library still glowing faintly through the glass. She wondered if the boy was asleep. She wondered if peace ever truly existed in houses like this. And then, without realizing, she smiled softly, not because anything was right, but because somewhere deep inside her, she still believed it could be. In another part of the mansion, Eleanor stirred in her sleep. A dream haunted her, a sound she couldn't place, a whisper that wasn't real but felt too close. It was the voice of a child, calling her name, not in love, but in longing. When she woke, her heart was racing. She sat up in bed, her hand over her chest, and for the first time in years, she didn't know whether she was angry or afraid. The house returned to silence, but it was no longer the silence of control. It was the silence before confession. And somewhere, in the space between guilt and grace, truth waited, patient, invisible, unbreakable. The following morning unfolded like a ritual repeated too many times. The air was heavy with routine, the clatter of silver, the whisper of fabric, the quiet rush to appear perfect. But behind the polished surfaces, doubt had taken root. Mr. Beaumont woke earlier than usual. The first light had barely touched the curtains when he left the bed. His wife stirred slightly but didn't open her eyes. For years, she had trained herself not to question where he went at dawn. The absence was just another part of their luxury. He walked through the hallway barefoot, feeling the cold marble beneath his feet. The house was never truly quiet. Even silence had a sound. The ticking of the old clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the wind slipping through the keyholes. He stopped by Daniel's room. The door was slightly open. The boy was still asleep, curled up under a thin blanket, the stuffed rabbit pressed against his chest. A streak of sunlight fell across his face, making him look like a painting, fragile, untouched, and too precious for the world he was born into. The father stood there for a long moment. Then he noticed it, the window. It wasn't fully closed. A gentle breeze lifted the curtain, letting in the faint scent of the garden, the smell of damp grass and roses, and beyond that scent, something else. The quiet reminder of how small freedoms find their way into closed places. He closed the window slowly and turned away. Downstairs, Maria was already awake. She was in the kitchen preparing the morning trays, one for the dining room, one for the boy, one for the staff. The smell of fresh bread filled the air again, warm and alive. It was the only scent that made the mansion feel human. She moved with calm precision, though her eyes were tired. The other maids whispered as she worked. Some admired her strength, others warned her to stay invisible. In houses like this, kindness could become a crime if noticed by the wrong eyes. As she poured milk into a porcelain jug, she felt it, a gaze. She turned slightly and saw Mr. Beaumont in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his usual stern expression. There was something different. Curiosity, perhaps, or guilt. He didn't speak, and neither did she, but the silence between them said everything. He watched the way her hands trembled when she lifted the tray, not from fear, from exhaustion. He saw the small cut that had healed poorly on her palm. It was the same wound he had noticed once before, but ignored. Now it seemed to tell a story of labor, pain, and dignity held in quiet defiance. When she left the room, he stayed behind for a moment. He looked around. The simple order of the kitchen, the modest flowers on the counter, the traces of warmth that didn't exist anywhere else in the house. For the first time, he realized that this room, not the grand halls, was the only place in the mansion that still felt alive. Upstairs, Eleanor prepared for another day, as though preparing for battle. Her reflection glared back at her from the mirror. The diamonds on her ears glinted under the morning light, but even they couldn't distract her from what she saw, the faint shadow of something. human beneath the perfection. When she entered the dining hall, she found her husband already seated, a rare occurrence. His newspaper lay untouched. His eyes were distant, his thoughts somewhere else. She spoke, but her voice met no answer. The silence between them had turned into a wall. At the far end of the room, Maria entered to serve breakfast. She placed the plates carefully, her presence as quiet as her steps. But this time, the air shifted. Mr. Beaumont's gaze lingered, not in impropriety, but in awareness. Eleanor noticed. The spoon in her hand paused mid-air. It lasted only a second, but seconds in that house were dangerous things. After breakfast, the father left early for his office. At least that's what Eleanor believed. In truth, he didn't go far. He stopped by the garden first. The morning sun caught the dew on the roses, turning them into small jewels. The swing, the red one, swayed lightly in the wind. He stood there watching it move, realizing how something so simple could carry so much memory. He remembered Daniel on that swing, laughing years ago. He remembered the sound of his wife's voice calling from the balcony, sharp, commanding, impatient. And he remembered the look in his son's eyes, the look that said he was already learning what love wasn't. The wind pushed the swing again, soft but deliberate. And for the first time, the man wondered if the house itself was trying to tell him something, if the walls, the garden, even the silence had been witnesses all along. Later that evening, after everyone had gone to bed, he returned to his study. A candle burned low on his desk, casting light over papers he didn't read. Instead, he looked at the family portraits lining the wall. He saw his wife, perfect as ever, himself younger, proud, the boy smiling, and then his eyes caught something he hadn't noticed before. In the corner of one of the frames, a faint reflection. Behind the boy, a blurred figure, Maria, standing at a distance, watching him with gentle eyes. She hadn't meant to be in the picture. She had simply been there, part of the truth they had chosen to crop out. He leaned closer. The photograph was like a confession. In a world built on appearances, the real things always found a way to hide in the background, waiting to be seen. He closed his eyes, the image burning into his mind. For the first time in years, he prayed, not with words, but with regret. That night, the red swing outside didn't move. At all. The wind was still. The garden slept. But somewhere deep inside the mansion, something had shifted again. Something quiet, irreversible. Because once the heart begins to question, the truth no longer stays silent. The morning sun slipped through the high windows like something forbidden, light trespassing into a world that preferred shadows. Mr. Beaumont sat alone in the study, pretending to read. The pages turned, but his eyes did not follow the words. His mind was elsewhere, somewhere between what he feared and what he refused to believe. The truth was still invisible, but now it had shape, it had scent, it had weight. He began to notice everything, Eleanor's tone when she spoke about the servants, the sudden hush that fell when Maria entered a room, the way the boy's shoulders tensed whenever his mother approached. None of it was loud, none of it was obvious, but together it sounded like a symphony of quiet cruelty. He told himself he needed proof, not gossip, not instinct, but something real. So he watched. He waited, and in the waiting he saw what had always been there. At breakfast, he arrived earlier than usual. Eleanor was already seated, perfect as always. A crimson dress, golden earrings, hands folded neatly beside the cup. Maria entered moments later with the tray, her presence modest, her eyes lowered. The silver lid reflected the chandelier's light, the kind of beauty that burns when it hides pain beneath it. Eleanor's voice broke the silence. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was precision, each word a blade polished over years of practice. Maria placed the dishes, her movements exact, rehearsed by repetition. But when the tray slipped slightly, just slightly, Eleanor's hand reached out, steady and quick, not to help but to remind. The spoon didn't fall, but something in the room did. Mr. Beaumont's gaze moved slowly between them. He said nothing, but his silence was no longer protection. It was witness. When the meal ended, he rose before his wife. "I'll take the boy to the garden," he said, though no one had asked. Eleanor hesitated. Control rarely faced interruption, but she smiled her practiced smile, the kind that pretended not to be wounded by defiance. Outside, the garden was damp with morning dew. The red swing waited in its usual stillness, the ropes glowing faintly under the light. Daniel followed his father quietly. He didn't run, didn't play. He simply looked up, searching for permission to exist. Freely again. "Go on," the father said softly. The boy approached the swing. He touched it carefully, as if afraid it would vanish if he held on too tightly. Then he sat, his small legs brushing the grass. The ropes creaked, that same familiar sound. Old wood, old secrets. From a distance, Maria watched. She had come to water the flowers, but her eyes couldn't help finding the boy. For a brief moment, he looked at her and smiled, not with joy, but with gratitude, a quiet, private language that only hearts who have suffered the same can understand. Mr. Beaumont saw it, the connection, the silent bond built not on words, but on survival. When he returned to the house, Eleanor was waiting by the window. She didn't ask how it went. She didn't need to. She had seen everything, the swing, the smile, the disobedience. Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned cold. "Children learn what they are allowed to repeat," she said. He didn't answer. He only looked at her, and in that look, she felt something she hadn't in years, opposition. For the rest of the day, the mansion seemed quieter than usual. The servants spoke in whispers. The boy hid among the books in the library, and Maria worked with the same grace as always, but her heart carried an invisible tremor. She could feel that something had shifted. That night the father didn't sleep. He stayed in the study with a single candle burning beside him, the flame trembling like a heartbeat. He opened his notebook, once full of business ledgers, and began to write. Not numbers, not plans, thoughts, questions, fragments of truth too dangerous to speak aloud. When did I stop being a husband and become a witness? What kind of home keeps its light hidden behind locked doors? And why does kindness frighten those who fear reflection? He closed the notebook and stared at the window. Outside, the red swing moved again, though the wind had died hours ago. It swayed once, twice, then stilled, as if an invisible hand had let go. Somewhere in the servants' quarters, Maria awoke from a dream. Her breath came quick, her heart restless. She didn't know why, only that the night felt too still, too expectant. And in the main bedroom, Eleanor stood by her mirror, brushing her hair with slow, controlled strokes. The brush passed through perfectly arranged strands, but her eyes were unfocused. Behind her reflection, in the darkened glass, she thought she saw movement, a shape, a whisper, a reminder of everything she had tried to bury. The truth had begun to stir. It was no longer quiet. It was waiting. Night fell like a curtain closing on something sacred. The mansion exhaled its evening routine, lights dimming, footsteps softening, the quiet hum of expensive loneliness. Mr. Beaumont sat by the window of his study, staring at the empty garden. The red swing glowed faintly under the moonlight, like a ghost waiting to be remembered. He had begun his quiet experiment. Small actions, unnoticed, but deliberate. That morning he had told Eleanor he would travel to the city for business. She hadn't asked why, only nodded, relieved perhaps to have the house to herself again. But he hadn't gone far. He had hidden himself in the guest wing upstairs, listening, observing. From that distance, he saw things he had never dared to look at before. The way Eleanor's voice changed when she spoke to the staff, softer when others listened, sharper when they didn't. The way Daniel flinched when she entered the room. The way Maria avoided crossing her path entirely, moving like someone who knew that visibility was dangerous. Each gesture was a thread, and together They wove the pattern he had been too blind to see. At noon, he heard laughter, small, fragile, but real. He followed the sound to the garden, careful not to be seen. Through the ivy-covered window, he saw his son with Maria near the swing. She wasn't teaching him anything, only listening in the way only kind people do, with silence that feels safe. The boy held a toy soldier in one hand, talking quietly, and she nodded as though every word was sacred. It was the first time he had seen his son speak freely in weeks, and that small freedom was enough to break his heart. Then Eleanor appeared. Her red dress caught the light like a flame against the garden's green. Her steps were measured, her face still, but her eyes, they burned with something the father hadn't seen before. Not anger, not jealousy, fear. Maria stepped back immediately, bowing her head. The boy froze, the toy slipping from his hand. Eleanor's lips moved, but her voice didn't reach the window. It didn't need to. The silence spoke for her. Later that evening, when the house settled into its cold order again, he watched her from across the dinner table. Her beauty was the same, perfect, sculpted, untouched by time. But now, beneath that perfection, he saw something fragile, a crack in the marble, and through that crack he saw the truth. She was terrified of losing control. That night he approached the nursery quietly. The door was ajar. Maria sat in a chair beside the boy's bed, watching him sleep. Her hand rested lightly on the blanket, her eyes tired but calm. It was a mother's posture, gentle, instinctive, without claim. He didn't speak. He only stood there, the candlelight painting her in gold and shadow. When she finally looked up, she didn't flinch. There was no fear in her gaze, only a quiet understanding, like two souls recognizing each other through grief. He nodded once, a silent thank you, and left before the moment could become something dangerous. But danger had already found its way. From the dark end of the corridor, Eleanor had seen the door close. Her hand gripped the banister until her knuckles turned white. Her breath came slow, deliberate, and her reflection, caught in the glass, stared back at her like an enemy. In her mind, something sharp and ancient began to whisper, a fear that had lived inside her for years, now awake again, not of losing her husband, not even of losing her pride, but of being replaced by someone who carried the one thing she no longer could: gentleness. She walked away from the corridor, her heels silent against the floor. By morning, she would have a new mask, a new smile, a new plan. Because in houses built on silence, love becomes war. And in wars like this, the kindest heart is always the first to bleed. Morning returned, but it no longer belonged to peace. The mansion woke with its usual rhythm. The clink of porcelain, the distant hum of servants, the metallic whisper of cutlery being placed just right. Yet something in the air had changed. A presence, a plan, a mask. Eleanor Beaumont moved through her home with grace that didn't belong to the living. Her red dress trailed behind her like spilled wine. Her perfume lingered long after she passed, and her voice, soft, deliberate, hid the tremor of fear behind its melody. To anyone looking, she was still the perfect woman. But to anyone listening closely, she had become an echo of herself. Polished on the outside, cracking within. She smiled that morning more than usual. Too much. A smile that hid knives. She had breakfast served in the smaller dining hall, saying she wanted more intimacy. Her husband nodded politely, suspecting nothing. Maria was called to serve, a request Eleanor hadn't made in weeks. When Maria entered, the silence bent around her. The walls seemed to tighten, as if they knew something human was about to be tested. Eleanor gestured toward the table with a perfect gloved hand. Maria placed the dishes, her hands steady, but she felt the weight of the gaze pressing into her back. She could feel it like heat. When she turned slightly to pour the coffee, Eleanor's eyes were waiting, sharp, unblinking, calculating. There was no anger there, only curiosity. the kind of curiosity that studies weakness before it's used. Mr. Beaumont cleared his throat, breaking the stillness. The sound of his cup meeting the saucer echoed like thunder in that fragile peace. He didn't look up. He knew what was happening. And yet, he waited. Sometimes silence was the only weapon against poison disguised as civility. Maria finished her task and turned to leave. Eleanor's voice stopped her mid-step. Soft, controlled, beautiful. "Stay. I may need something later." Maria froze for half a second, then nodded gently. The line had been drawn. From that moment, the day moved differently. The air inside the mansion thickened. Every corridor seemed to whisper. Every object, the mirrors, the vases, even the piano, seemed to watch. By midday, Eleanor began her small war. Not through words, not through violence, through refinement, through gestures invisible to most eyes. The first was the schedule. Maria's tasks were changed. Double the work, half the rest. She was told to polish the marble floors again and again until they reflected her own exhaustion. Eleanor never raised her voice, never gave a direct order that could be called cruelty. She simply smiled and said, "You missed a spot." By evening, Maria's hands bled again. Tiny cracks reopened where the skin had healed. She didn't complain. She never did. But the blood left small marks on the cloth she used to clean the staircase, red stains against white silk. And from the top of the stairs, Eleanor watched. She saw those stains and smiled faintly, not out of joy, but relief. Power once, doubted, had to be proven again. But the house did not agree. It had begun to change its loyalties. The mirrors no longer reflected her clearly. The piano keys no longer sounded right when she touched them. Even the air around her seemed heavier, a quiet rebellion of the unseen. Late that night, Mr. Beaumont found Maria asleep in the servants' corridor, her head resting against the wall, her hands wrapped in cloth. The candle beside her had melted down to nothing. He stood there for a long time, the image cutting into him like a blade. This wasn't the natural order of a home. This was something else, something twisted by fear and pride. He reached for the blanket draped over a chair and covered her shoulders gently. For a brief moment, he wanted to say something, an apology, perhaps, or a promise, but he didn't. Words, in that house, had become dangerous things. When he turned to leave, he saw movement in the hallway, the shadow of a woman standing at the far end. Eleanor. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence said everything: accusation, betrayal, control. The next morning, the entire staff knew the lady of the house was displeased. And when she was displeased, someone always paid the price. By the next dawn, the house had returned to its fragile beauty, polished, perfumed, silent. But something invisible had begun to rot beneath the gold. Eleanor Beaumont stood by her vanity mirror, arranging roses in a glass vase. The thorns were still attached. Her reflection smiled, but it was the kind of smile that could bleed if you looked too closely. She had spent the night awake, not pacing, not crying, planning. Control, once cracked, must be rebuilt with precision. She started with something small. That morning, she requested that Maria serve tea in the parlor, a task normally reserved for the butler. The order sounded polite, harmless even. But it was a test, and every test in that house had only one purpose: humiliation, dressed as civility. Maria obeyed, as always. She entered the parlor carrying the silver tray, the china trembling faintly with each step. Eleanor sat by the piano, pretending to read, her fingers tracing the edge of a book she had no intention of opening. Mr. Beaumont stood by the window, back turned, aware but silent. Maria placed the tray on the table, careful, graceful, yet no movement could escape the scrutiny of that gaze. Eleanor looked up at her as one might study a painting they intend to destroy. "You've added too much sugar," she said softly. Maria froze. The spoon was untouched, the tea unserved. Eleanor smiled, not because she believed it, but because she could. The air in the room grew thin. Mr. Beaumont turned slowly, his eyes narrowing, his hand tightening around the newspaper he no longer pretended to read. Maria whispered a quiet apology, though none was due, and bowed her head. "Again," Eleanor said, still smiling, "prepare another. This time, make it perfect." Maria gathered the tray and left the room. Her hands shook once, just once, before she reached the door. Behind her, Eleanor's smile faded into something raw, something that looked like victory, but felt like loss. That night, Eleanor began her second move. Subtle, beautiful, cruel. She went to her husband's study after dinner, pretending warmth. She spoke of household matters, the garden, the servants. Then, as if an afterthought, she sighed. "She's different lately," she said. "The maid. There's something I can't quite trust." The words were light, almost careless, but they were venom wrapped in silk. She didn't need him to believe. She only needed him to doubt. He didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at her, really looked, and for the first time she felt small under his gaze. Not because he didn't believe her, but because he finally did see her. The part she had spent years hiding. The cruelty shaped by fear. "I'll handle it," he said quietly. But she couldn't tell whether it was a promise or a warning. Over the next days, the traps multiplied. Small things, placed with precision. A missing brooch, a broken vase, a key left near Maria's quarters, all designed to whisper the same lie. Guilt. And the mansion, once a home, became a stage. Each room another scene in a play only one woman understood. The servants grew restless. They didn't dare speak, but their eyes carried the truth, that the house itself had turned against its kindest soul. And in the center of it all, Maria remained silent, not out of fear, out of dignity. Every night she prayed in the dark, not for mercy but for strength to endure one more day without becoming bitter. Mr. Beaumont watched from the edges of each scene, unable to intervene without tearing apart the illusion of order his wife demanded. He saw her traps, her precision, her quiet madness. And though his silence protected Maria for now, it also made him complicit. Until one night, the lie became visible. It was near midnight when a cry echoed through the house. Glass shattered. Footsteps rushed down the corridor. Eleanor stood in her dressing gown at the top of the stairs, holding the broken vase. Her voice trembled with performance. "She broke it," she whispered. "I saw her." The servants froze. Maria stood behind her, her apron stained with dust, her eyes wide but not pleading. She didn't defend herself, because innocence, when faced with evil, doesn't shout. It stands still and lets the world decide what it's ready to. "See." Mr. Beaumont appeared moments later, drawn by the noise. His eyes moved from his wife's shaking hand to the maid's quiet face. The silence stretched thin as glass. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. Not in anger, in understanding. And Eleanor realized too late that the trap she had built had finally caught the wrong heart. The next morning rose in silence. No accusations, no apologies. Only the heavy quiet that follows a storm too contained to be seen. The servants moved. Carefully, their steps light as though afraid to wake the house. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The broken vase from the night before had been swept away, but the crack it left in the family's image still lingered, invisible but permanent. Mr. Beaumont didn't speak of it. He never did. Yet something in his posture had changed, the way he held his coffee cup, the way his eyes followed every movement of the morning. He was no longer a man distracted by comfort. He was awake and awake. Men in houses of secrets are dangerous things, Eleanor noticed. Of course she did. Her instincts were sharp, her mind quick. She smiled at him during breakfast, soft and practiced, but the warmth didn't reach her eyes. He nodded politely, and when she wasn't looking, his gaze turned toward the window, the garden, the red swing moving faintly in the wind, the same rhythm it always had, but now it sounded like memory trying to speak. That afternoon, when Eleanor left for her usual charity, meeting He went to the kitchen. The servants froze. Masters didn't visit that side of the house. But he didn't stop. He walked past them until he found her. Maria stood by the sink, rinsing the last of the morning dishes. Her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, her hands raw and red. The water shimmered in the light, turning her movements almost holy. An image of labor that carried more grace than all the chandeliers above them. She turned, startled, and bowed her head. He said nothing at first. Words were fragile in that place. They shattered too easily. Instead, he placed something on the counter, a folded handkerchief and a small tin of salve. "For your hands," he murmured finally, his voice low, careful, human. Maria hesitated. The gesture felt too kind, too dangerous, but then she nodded once, not as a servant, but as a soul who understood gratitude beyond words. He left before anyone could see. That night, the handkerchief remained by her bedside, untouched, but not because she didn't want it, because she wanted to remember that kindness could still exist without asking anything in return. In the main wing, Eleanor returned home later than usual. The smell of rain followed her, sharp, metallic. She found her husband reading in the study, a sight that had once been ordinary, but now felt like intrusion. "You're still awake?" she asked, her tone light, her eyes searching. He smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep." His voice was calm, but it carried something new. Distance, the kind of distance that isn't physical but moral, like a curtain drawn between two people who once stood too close. She approached him, her perfume filling the room like smoke. "You've been quiet lately." He looked up at her. "Just listening." "To what?" she asked. He closed the book, gently. "To what I've ignored for too long." The silence that followed was alive, trembling, dangerous. For the first time, she didn't know what to say. Her words, once weapons, had lost their edge. Against something she couldn't see, awareness. Later, when he left the room, she watched him go, her heart burning with a fear she couldn't name. In the servants' quarters, Maria sat by the window, the moonlight cutting through the darkness like truth through deceit. She held the small tin in her hand, staring at the reflection of her own face in the metal lid. She thought of the boy, the way he smiled despite everything. She thought of the man who had begun to notice, and she thought of the woman upstairs whose beauty had turned to frost. Somewhere deep inside her, she knew this couldn't last. Goodness is always hunted in houses that worship appearances. The next day, the first act of protection began. Quietly, invisibly. The gardener was told to deliver Maria's meals separately. A message was sent to the village doctor asking for healing ointment anonymously. And one envelope, sealed with wax, left the mansion that afternoon, addressed to no one and everyone, to whom truth still matters. No one saw who sent it, but the letter would find its way. Truth always does. And as the sun fell behind the mansion that evening, the wind picked up again, brushing through the roses and the red swing that waited in silence. The rope creaked softly, keeping time with the rhythm of unseen change. In that sound, if you listened closely, you could almost hear a promise. The house was no longer hers. It began with a whisper, not from a mouth, but from the house itself. A whisper, carried through doors half closed, through corridors that seemed to breathe. By the third morning, Eleanor knew. The handkerchief, the salve, the kindness that was not hers to give. She found out the way all proud hearts do, not through confession, but through observation. A servant too quiet, a trace of scent that did not belong in the wrong room, a softness in her husband's voice when he spoke the maid's name by accident. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was compassion. And to Eleanor, compassion was betrayal. She stood by the window of her dressing room that afternoon, staring into the garden. The red swing swayed in the wind again, its rope shining in the sunlight, mocking her stillness. Every time it moved, she saw it. Maria's face, calm and humble, framed by blue cloth and white apron. That serenity, that unbearable peace, became a mirror she could not stand to look at. Jealousy has many faces, but the cruelest of them looks like righteousness. That night, she called the butler. Her tone was cordial, her words careful, her expression unreadable. "There's been irregular behavior in the servants' wing," she said. "I'd like it corrected before it becomes a stain on this house." The man bowed. "Of course, ma'am. What kind of irregularity?" "Familiarity," she answered simply, "between those who should not forget their place." And with that, the order was set in motion. Maria felt it before she knew it. The air changed. The eyes of the servants turned away from her, not in cruelty, but in fear. The meals that once arrived warm now came late and cold. The key to the linen room went missing, though she had always been trusted with it. Small things, but in a house of perfection, small things meant intent. By evening, she was called to the main hall. Eleanor waited at the top of the stairs, draped in shadow and silk. Her voice was velvet and venom. "The silver set is missing," she said. "From the tea service." Maria looked up, confused. Her hands clutched the hem of her apron. She had polished that very set 2 days ago. It was perfect, untouched. Eleanor continued, "I won't accuse. I only ask for honesty." The words were sweet, but their meaning was poison. The servants gathered near the doorway. They knew better than to speak. Injustice was contagious here. No one wanted to catch it. Maria shook her head slowly. "I didn't." Eleanor raised a hand, cutting the air in silence. "Enough." Mr. Beaumont entered just then, drawn by the murmurs. His eyes darted between them, the wife poised like marble, the maid trembling in blue. "What is this?" he asked, voice low. "An unfortunate incident," Eleanor replied, smiling. "The silver is gone. I'm sure there's an explanation." There was no missing silver, but lies, when told by beauty, sound like music. The boy appeared at the top of the stairs then, rubbing his eyes, barefoot in his nightclothes. He saw Maria standing below, tears burning in her eyes, though none had fallen. He didn't understand, but he felt the wrongness in the air. Mr. Beaumont looked at his son and saw the truth written there: fear, innocence, loyalty. He turned to his wife, the silence between them now heavier than words. His voice came calm, deliberate. "We'll search together." Eleanor froze. That was not the script she had written. He descended the stairs slowly, passing Maria, his hand brushing the railing where she had scrubbed the marble until her skin broke. He stopped, looked at her, and nodded. Once, not in pity, but in defiance. The servants watched as husband and wife searched opposite corners of the room. It didn't take long. The silver set was found, exactly where it always was, wrapped in linen, untouched. No one spoke. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she placed the cover back on the chest. Her face remained beautiful, but the kind of beauty that hurts to look at, like ice catching the light. She turned to Maria. "You may go," she whispered. Maria bowed her head, her steps steady, though her heart was breaking. When the room was empty, Mr. Beaumont looked at his wife. His voice was low, cold. "Never again." It was not a threat. It was a sentence. That night, Eleanor wept for the first time in years, not out of guilt, but because she could feel it slipping, the illusion, the control, the house that had obeyed her for so long now turning its gaze toward someone else. In the garden, the red swing moved once more in the wind, as if carrying away the last of her lies. And Maria, alone in her small room, pressed the handkerchief to her face, not to dry her tears, but to remember that kindness had survived the cruelty. The truth had not won yet, but it had learned how to breathe. The next days unfolded with strange quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after an earthquake, when nothing looks broken, but everything has shifted. The mansion glimmered again under sunlight, the roses trimmed, the marble floors shining. Yet, beneath that perfection, a wound pulsed, silent, unseen, waiting. Eleanor spent her mornings in front of the mirror, adjusting her reflection until it looked like control again. But the glass betrayed her. Her beauty remained, but her eyes no longer obeyed. They flickered, restless, haunted by what she couldn't erase, the moment her lie had failed to bend the truth. Mr. Beaumont spoke little. He went through his routines with quiet grace: breakfast, letters, the garden. But there was distance in his voice, like a man walking through the ruins of a house still standing. And Maria, she worked as always, though her movements had grown slower, her eyes distant, not out of fear, but because she could feel something approaching. Children sense storms before adults do. Daniel began to notice things no one else dared to say aloud: the tension, the whispers, the way his mother's laughter sounded wrong, sharp where it used to be light. He saw Maria's tired hands and the bandages that now covered her wrists. He saw the way his father lingered in doorways when she was near, not in secrecy, but in quiet guardianship. And one evening, while wandering through the garden, he found something small that changed everything. It was near the old swing, the red one that had watched so many secrets. There, half buried under the roots of a rosebush, he found a piece of silver, a teaspoon with the Beaumont crest. It had been placed there, not dropped, too clean to have been forgotten. He turned it in his hands, the sunlight, catching the engraved B at the center. A thought formed in his small, trembling heart, one that no child should have to hold. He knew what it meant. He understood that truth had been buried, just like this. That night, when the dinner bell rang, he hid the spoon inside his jacket pocket. The table gleamed with crystal and candlelight. The family sat together, dressed in silence. Eleanor's perfume filled the air, sweet and suffocating. Maria stood at a distance, serving carefully, her eyes lowered. Daniel's small hand tightened under the table. He watched his mother's smile, perfect and hollow. Then, when her hand reached for her glass, he spoke, softly, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I found this," he said. He placed the silver spoon on the table. The sound was small, just metal meeting porcelain, but it cut through the room like thunder. Eleanor froze. Mr. Beaumont looked at the spoon, then at his wife. Maria stood motionless, her breath caught halfway. Daniel's eyes filled with tears, but his voice didn't shake. It was under the roses. Someone hid it there. No one moved. Eleanor's face paled, her beauty cracking like paint under too much heat. For the first time, she couldn't find a word to use as a shield. The silence that followed wasn't mercy, it was exposure. Mr. Beaumont stood slowly. His hand brushed the back of the chair, not in anger, but in quiet judgment. He turned to Maria. "Leave the table," he said softly. "You've served enough for tonight." She obeyed, though her heart ached. She didn't look back. When the door closed behind her, the man turned to his wife. His voice came low, steady, almost kind, the kind that only truth can afford. "I told you never again." Eleanor's eyes flickered with something between panic and denial. "It was only a mistake," she whispered. But he was already walking away, not in rage, in grief, because love doesn't die in betrayal, it dies in exhaustion. Later that night, Daniel went to Maria's small room. He knocked softly, holding something in his hand. When she opened the door, he held out a small red rose, one from the garden, its stem still wet with rain. "I told the truth," he said simply. Maria knelt, tears finally falling as she took the flower. She didn't speak, because gratitude that deep has no words. She just held the child close, the red rose trembling between them. Outside, the wind moved through the garden, brushing the swing until it began to sway again. And for the first time, the sound didn't feel like mourning. It felt like something waking up, because innocence had done what power could not. It had revealed the truth without anger, only light. The next morning arrived without color. The sky above the mansion was pale and empty, like a memory half erased. Even the birds refused to sing. Eleanor sat at her vanity, her face illuminated by the cold light of dawn. Her hands trembled slightly as she fixed her hair, though she told herself it was just the chill. But deep inside, she knew what it was. Fear, the kind that crawls in slowly, not as punishment but as consequence. She had spent years controlling everything, what was seen, what was said, what was remembered. And now, for the first time, she realized she no longer controlled how she was seen. The servants avoided her eyes. The boy no longer came to kiss her cheek in the morning, and her husband, the man who once obeyed silence as religion, now spoke less out of respect and more out of distance. The power she had mistaken for love was slipping through her hands grain by grain. She rose from her chair, her reflection following like a ghost. The mirror no longer flattered her. It showed the truth beneath the skin, the fatigue, the hollow eyes, the cruelty she had polished into elegance. She turned away, but the image stayed with her. Downstairs, Maria moved quietly, cleaning the same surfaces she had touched for years. The difference now was that she was no longer invisible. Her presence, once tolerated, now carried meaning. The house seemed to follow her with its eyes, the walls, the windows, even the light. Daniel passed her in the hallway and stopped. He looked up at her and smiled, the same way sunlight sometimes breaks through clouds. It was a small moment, but in that mansion, small kindnesses were revolutions. When Eleanor descended the stairs, she saw them, a child smiling, a servant glowing with quiet peace, and she felt something cold grip her chest, jealousy of a kind she didn't understand, not of beauty, not of youth, but of freedom. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble as she approached. The sound was the same as always, but the meaning had changed. Every step sounded like defiance, like the ghost of the woman she once was trying to reclaim her throne. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice lined with sweetness. He turned, cautious. "Come here, darling. I want to talk." He obeyed, hesitant, his small hand brushing Maria's arm before he let go. In the parlor, Eleanor knelt to meet his gaze. Her smile was gentle, but her eyes carried a tremor that only the young can see. "I know you meant well," she said, "but there are things children shouldn't speak of, things they can't understand." The boy looked down. "I understood." Her breath caught. She hadn't expected that. She stood abruptly, turning away before her voice could betray her. From the doorway, Maria watched silently. She could sense what was happening. The attempt to rewrite guilt into innocence again, but something in the air told her that this time it wouldn't work. Later that afternoon, the first omen appeared. The sky darkened earlier than usual. Thunder rolled softly in the distance, and the scent of rain seeped into the house through the open windows. Mr. Beaumont returned early from town. He walked past his wife without a word, removed his gloves, and placed a folded letter on the table. It was sealed in red wax. Eleanor stared at it. The wax bore a mark she didn't recognize, a simple emblem, like a leaf or a flame. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes met hers with a calm she couldn't read. "It's from the city magistrate," he said finally. "An inquiry about our staff, about mistreatment." The world stopped for a heartbeat. She felt the blood leave her face. Her voice came faintly, almost whispering. Who would? But she already knew. The envelope he had sent days ago, to whom truth still matters. It had found its way, and now justice had entered the house wearing silence as its armor. That night rain poured hard against the windows. The wind howled through the halls like voices long forgotten. Eleanor sat alone in her room, the mirror turned to the wall. She tried to pray, but the words refused to come. Even God seemed to have stepped outside. Downstairs, Maria watched the storm from the servant's window. Daniel slept peacefully in the next room, the sound of rain soothing him like a lullaby. She whispered a quiet prayer, not for revenge, but for peace. And in that moment, the thunder outside felt less like chaos and more like cleansing. Because some storms don't come to destroy. They come to wash away what should never have been allowed to bloom. The storm had not ended. It had simply moved inside the house. By the following morning, the Beaumont mansion no longer belonged to silence. It belonged to waiting. Rain still brushed against the windows, soft but endless. The Bainan servants spoke only in glances. Even the walls seemed to listen. Eleanor walked through the hall with her chin high, her dress black this time, as though mourning the world before it had even changed. Her reflection followed in every mirror, multiplied, each version of her pretending not to tremble. When the knock came at the door, it was not loud, just 3 simple taps. But in a house built on secrets, even soft knocks sound like judgment. Mr. Beaumont opened it himself. 2 men stood. Outside, their coats wet from the rain, their hats dripping onto the stone. They carried no weapons, only notebooks, the kind used by those who record truth. "City Magistrate's office," one of them said. "We received a letter." Eleanor appeared behind her husband, her voice sharp but polite. "Surely there's some mistake." But the man only looked at her, not rudely, but with the quiet knowledge of someone who had heard that sentence too many times. They entered the house. The sound of wet boots on marble echoed through the hall like a warning. Maria was in the kitchen when she heard it. Her hands froze in the water. For a moment she thought of running, not from guilt, but from memory. But then she remembered the boy's rose on her nightstand, still alive in its glass of water, and she stayed. The inspection began with questions, simple ones. Who handled the servants' pay? Who kept the keys to the storage rooms? Who signed the maintenance orders? Every answer pointed to the same place. The lady of the house. Eleanor sat in the parlour, her back straight, her hands folded perfectly in her lap. She answered calmly, her tone elegant, her lies wrapped in manners. But even her grace began to crumble when the boy entered the room. Daniel stood beside his father, small and solemn, his hair still damp from the rain. He looked at the men with the notebooks, then at his mother. "She was kind to me," he said softly. The words fell into the air like drops of truth into poisoned water. "No," unspoke. Eleanor blinked slowly, the sound of her heartbeat louder than thunder. Her son's words were not accusation, they were absolution, and that somehow hurt more. The inspector turned a page. "Is this the maid?" he asked. Maria was called in, her apron still damp, her eyes steady. She stood near the door, the smell of soap and rain clinging to her like armor. The questions came again, soft, formal, heavy. She answered each one without defense, her voice trembling only once, when they asked if she had ever been struck or humiliated. Her silence then said enough. Mr. Beaumont's jaw tightened. Eleanor turned away. When the interview ended, the men closed their notebooks and rose. They thanked the family, but their politeness carried the weight of conclusion. "We'll report back to the city," one said. "There will be a hearing." Eleanor's fingers dug into the armrest of her chair. Her knuckles whitened, her beauty burning beneath the collapse of control. When the door closed, behind them, the house exhaled, a long, tired sigh, like a body finally freed from a fever. That evening, the sky cleared. Sunlight filtered through the clouds for the first time in days. The red swing in the garden shimmered with raindrops, each one catching the light like glass. Maria stood by the window watching it sway. She didn't smile. Not yet. Freedom, she knew, never arrives with applause. It arrives in silence, when the fear stops breathing. Upstairs, Eleanor stared out another window, her reflection faint against the fading storm. For the first time in her life, she understood the cruelty of her own perfection, because perfection had kept her untouched, and untouched meant unloved. In the study, Mr. Beaumont sat alone, the candle burning low beside him. He wrote nothing, said nothing. He simply looked at his hands, the same hands that had built a home for appearance, not for truth. And for the first time, he wished to destroy what he had once built. That night, no one in the mansion slept, but the silence was different now. It wasn't fear, it was change. Days later, the world outside the mansion began to murmur. Whispers moved through the town like wind through tall grass, soft but unstoppable. People spoke of the Beaumonts in hushed voices at the market, in the church, near the post office. No one knew everything, but everyone knew enough. enough to sense that something once untouchable had fallen. The newspapers didn't print names, only hints. A family under investigation, allegations of cruelty, a servant's silence louder than her words. But in a city that fed on elegance, even the shadow of scandal was enough to shatter glass reputations. Eleanor didn't leave the house. The curtains remained drawn. Her world, once made of tea parties and piano recitals, had shrunk to a single room, a single mirror, a single truth she refused to face. She wandered through the halls like a ghost, haunting her own past. Every object reminded her of what she had lost, not the admiration, but the control. The perfume on her dresser smelled like something dead, trying to remember beauty. One afternoon, she heard laughter coming from the garden, soft, real, alive. She went to the window. Daniel sat on the red swing, the boy's small body outlined by the sunlight. Maria stood nearby, watering the flowers. Her hands still bore faint scars, but they moved gently, without fear. For a long moment, Eleanor watched them, her son and the woman she had, tried to erase. It wasn't hatred she felt anymore. It was something colder, recognition. The sound of the swing creaking became unbearable. She closed the curtain, but the sound stayed inside her head. That evening, Mr. Beaumont returned from the city. He carried no letters, no official papers, just exhaustion. Eleanor waited for him in the parlor, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The fire burned low, the light flickering between them. "What will they do?" she asked quietly. "For now, nothing," he replied. "But they know enough." Her eyes lifted to his, searching for mercy. None came. "Do you hate me?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, I just stopped protecting the wrong things." The fire cracked between them, a spark landing on the carpet before fading. She stared into the flames. "And her?" He paused before answering. "She reminds me of what I once thought we could be." Eleanor didn't cry. Not yet. Tears are too honest for pride. When he left the room, she sat alone by the fire, her shadow trembling on the wall behind her. And for the first time, she realized that the house didn't echo her steps anymore. It no longer belonged to her. The next morning, officials returned, not to punish, but to verify. They spoke briefly with the staff, took notes, and left quietly. But their presence left an invisible mark, the way thunder lingers after lightning. By evening, the servants had changed how they looked at Maria. They no longer saw a maid. They saw someone who had endured and remained pure. The boy followed her everywhere, his laughter slowly returning, light but cautious, like a bird learning to fly again. And the man, he moved through his home with a strange calm, a man rebuilding his soul in silence. Eleanor, meanwhile, began to fade into absence. Her beauty still commanded the light, but her presence no longer filled the room. It was as though the air had stopped listening to her voice. She started spending hours at the window, watching the garden. Sometimes she thought she saw her younger self out there, walking barefoot through the grass, free of fear, untouched by vanity. That girl looked at her with pity. The days passed like this, each one quieter than the last. But silence, when filled with regret, grows heavy enough to crush a heart. One night Eleanor wandered into the garden. The moonlight lay soft across the roses. The red swing moved gently, pushed by the wind. She reached out, her fingers brushing the rope. It was rough, real, unlike her life of silk and mirrors. She closed her eyes, and for the first time she whispered the truth. "I wanted love." The night didn't answer, but the wind did. It carried her voice away like confession. From the house, Maria watched through the window. She didn't move, didn't speak. She simply let the image burn itself into her heart, not as triumph, but as forgiveness waiting to be born. And when Eleanor turned back toward the mansion, the light inside looked different, warmer, softer, no longer hers, but finally honest. Morning rose, pale and forgiving. For the first time in months, the mansion smelled of bread again, not of wealth, but of life. The windows were open, the air moved freely through the halls. The silence that once suffocated now felt like rest. Maria was in the kitchen before sunrise, her hands steady, her mind quiet. She no longer waited for permission to exist. The house had accepted her, not with applause, but with peace. As the sun climbed higher, the rooms filled with light. It touched the portraits, the silver, the floors she had scrubbed with bleeding hands, and in that light, everything looked softer, even the past. Eleanor woke to that light. She blinked against it, unprepared. Her room, once a fortress of velvet and mirrors, felt different now, smaller, simpler, more human. She sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of her silk robe feeling heavier than ever. There were no letters waiting, no servants at her door, no audience left to impress. Only the truth. Downstairs, she heard laughter. It was faint, the sound of a child. For a moment she thought it was memory playing tricks on her, but then she heard it again, real, alive. She stood, her bare feet brushing the cold floor, and followed the sound. In the garden, Daniel was playing. His small hands pushed the red swing, his smile catching the light like something sacred. Beside him stood Maria, holding a basket of flowers. Her dress was faded, her apron patched, yet somehow she looked radiant, like the earth itself had lent her its calm. Eleanor stopped by the window, half hidden by the curtain. The sight pierced her, not in jealousy but in recognition. It was love, real, simple, unpolished, the kind she had chased all her life in mirrors, never realizing it had always lived outside them. She watched Maria kneel beside the boy to tie his shoe. The gesture was ordinary, but in its grace Eleanor saw everything she had lost. Not wealth, not beauty, but tenderness. The child noticed her through the glass and waved. She hesitated, then lifted her hand slowly, returning the gesture. It was small. It was everything. That afternoon, Eleanor did something no one expected. She went to the servants' quarters. The air there smelled of soap and bread, humble, clean, unpretentious. She stood at the doorway, her shadow falling across the threshold. Maria turned, surprised, and set aside her work. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence between them was alive, full of things that words would only ruin. Eleanor finally said, "I came to thank you." Her voice trembled, unused to humility. Maria lowered her eyes. "There's no need, Mom." "There is," Eleanor insisted softly. "You protected what I almost destroyed." The words hung in the air like confession. Maria didn't answer. She only nodded, not as a servant but as a witness. Then Eleanor noticed the handkerchief, neatly folded on the table, clean, untouched, the one her husband had given. For a brief moment, the three stories, the man, the maid, the mistress, all met in that single square of cloth, and in that fragile stillness, forgiveness began to take shape. Eleanor returned to her room before sunset. The house seemed gentler now, as if the walls had exhaled at last. From her window, she could see Maria and Daniel walking among the roses. Their laughter carried through the evening air, mingling with the sound of the swing creaking softly. Eleanor pressed her hand to the glass. The light outside turned golden, wrapping the garden in warmth. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel excluded from it. She felt part of it. Not as the woman who ruled, but as the woman who had finally learned to see. When night came, she didn't draw the curtains. She let the stars watch her sleep, and as the red swing swayed gently under the moonlight, the mansion, once filled with ghosts of pride, began to breathe like something alive again. Because forgiveness, when it comes, doesn't sound like thunder. It sounds like peace returning to a place that had forgotten how to feel. Night fell quietly over the Beaumont estate. The rain had stopped days ago, but the earth still carried its memory. That scent of something washed, forgiven. Inside, the fire burned low in the grand fireplace, painting the walls in soft orange light. Mr. Beaumont sat alone in his study. The papers on his desk remained untouched. Even the ink in his pen had dried. He had spent his whole life solving problems with signatures, with power, with control, but this was something no document could fix. When the door creaked open, he didn't turn. He already knew it was her. Eleanor stepped into the room. She no longer looked like the woman in portraits. No jewels, no cold smile, no armor. Her hair was loose, her face pale and sincere. She stood in the doorway for a moment, as if asking permission from the silence. He finally spoke, his voice tired but gentle. "It's been a long time. Since you came in here." She looked around. "This room used to frighten me. You always seemed so far away in it." "I was," he said simply. The fire crackled. Their shadows trembled across the bookshelves side by side, like two memories trying to meet again. "I came to ask you something," Eleanor whispered. "Will you ever be able to forgive me?" He didn't answer right away. The kind of forgiveness she asked for wasn't a word. It was a life rebuilt from ashes. He rose slowly from the chair, crossing the room. For the first time in years, he stood close enough for her to see the weariness in his eyes, the same pain that had lived in hers. "I don't know if I can," he said softly, "but I know I don't want to hate you anymore." Her breath caught. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a beginning. "I didn't mean for things to go so far," she murmured. "I wanted to keep everything perfect, and I ended up destroying everything real." He nodded. Perfection does that. For a long moment, they stood in silence, not enemies, not lovers, just two people stripped of illusion. "You were right about her," Eleanor said finally. "About Maria." He looked at her, waiting. "She loves him," Eleanor whispered. "Not for his name, not for the house, just for who he is." "She saved him," he replied. "And maybe she's saving us too." Eleanor smiled faintly, a smile too small to fix anything, but honest enough to hurt. "I was cruel to her," she said, "but I see her now. The strength I thought I had, she carried all along." He turned toward the window, the moonlight reflecting in his tired eyes. "You can tell her that." Eleanor shook her head. "Not yet. She deserves peace, not my presence." She took a step back, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know who I am without the pride, without the anger. I only know I don't want to be that woman anymore." He met her gaze. "Then don't." Simple words, heavy as mercy. Eleanor's lips trembled, but she didn't cry. She bowed her head. Instead, as if receiving an invisible blessing, when she left the study, the house didn't feel haunted anymore. The ghosts had names now: pride, fear, silence, and all of them were finally leaving. In the garden, Maria tucked Daniel into bed early. The boy had asked if his mother would come say good night, and Maria had simply smiled. She will, in her own way. And somewhere upstairs, Eleanor stood by the window, whispering softly into the dark, "Good night, my son." The wind carried her words. Across the garden, brushing Daniel's hair as he slept, a whisper, a thread, a fragile bridge between guilt and grace. And when the house fell silent again, it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of something new being born. Sunday morning arrived with a brightness the house hadn't seen in years. The sky stretched wide and merciful above the garden. The same garden where so many tears had fallen, now washed clean by forgiveness. A gentle wind moved through the roses, brushing the red swing that still swayed softly in memory of what had been. Inside, the mansion was quiet, but not cold. People had gathered: the magistrate, the priest, a few townspeople, and the staff who had served the Beaumonts for decades. It wasn't a trial. It was something quieter, something sacred, a reckoning of hearts. Maria stood near the back, her hands folded before her apron. She hadn't wanted to come. She didn't like attention, especially not the kind born of pain. But Sueli had taken her hand that morning and whispered, "Sometimes silence needs witnesses too." So she came. At the front of the room stood Eleanor. Her beauty was still there, but it no longer led the room. Her humility did. She wore a plain grey dress, her hair tied back, no jewelry, no mask. For the first time in her life, she wasn't performing. She was present. When she began to speak, her voice trembled, but did not falter. "I've lived many years believing that love was something that had to obey me," she said, "that people, like furniture, should stay in the places I assigned them. I thought kindness was weakness, and silence was obedience, and I was wrong." Every word fell like rain on dry ground. The priest lowered his head. Mr. Beaumont listened from his chair, his eyes full of the quiet pain of recognition. Eleanor continued, "There is a woman in this room who taught me what I never learned in all my years of privilege, how to love without pride." The guests exchanged looks. Maria froze. Eleanor turned toward her. "She endured my cruelty and still showed compassion to my son when I no longer could. She held him when I was too proud to reach out, and through her gentleness I saw the truth, not of her place, but of mine." The silence grew so deep it became holy. "I cannot undo what I've done," Eleanor said, her voice breaking, "but I can bow to the woman who reminded me what grace looks like." And then, in a gesture no one expected, she stepped forward and knelt. The gasps rippled through the room. A rich woman kneeling before a maid, a moment that rewrote every line of power in that house. Maria took a step back. Her breath caught in her throat. "Please, ma'am, don't," she whispered. But Eleanor looked up at her, tears shining in her eyes. "It's the only way I know to tell the truth." Maria hesitated, then slowly knelt too. Two women, once divided by cruelty, now side by side. Not mistress and servant, but soul and mirror. Mr. Beaumont rose from his chair, his voice low and reverent. "Let this house remember this moment, because it began with cruelty and ends with courage." The priest closed his eyes. "May grace dwell here again." And when Eleanor stood, something inside her, that old, cold thing that had ruled her, stayed on the floor. She would never pick it up again. After the gathering ended, the house emptied quietly. Maria walked toward the garden, her steps light, her heart full. The sun had begun to set, the red swing glowing in the evening. Light. Behind her, Eleanor appeared at the doorway, watching in silence. Their eyes met one last time. No words, no tears, only mutual understanding. Forgiver and forgiven, both changed, both free. The boy came running then, his laughter echoing across the roses. He climbed onto the swing and looked up at the two women who had saved him in different ways. And for the first time, the sound of the swing didn't hurt anymore. It sang. Months passed like gentle waves, quiet, deliberate, unstoppable. The mansion that once echoed with judgment now hummed with the rhythm of ordinary life. No servants walking on eggshells, no raised voices, no cold orders that turned warmth into duty. The roses returned first. They always do. Then came the laughter. Daniel's voice, bright and unbroken, running through the corridors that had once swallowed every sound. He played in the garden every afternoon, his small hands gripping the ropes of the red swing, his hair dancing in the sunlight. He no longer looked haunted. He looked home. Maria watched him from the porch. Sometimes she would pause, a cloth still in her hands, just to listen. Each laugh felt like a hymn she had never known the words to. And every time he called her name, not maid, not miss, just Maria, she felt the world make sense again. Inside the house, Eleanor had changed in ways no one expected. Her steps were slower, her voice softer. She still carried elegance, but now it came from kindness, not control. She spent hours in the library writing letters, not to friends but to people she had wronged. Some letters she sent, some she kept. Forgiveness, she had learned, does not always need an audience. Once a week, she visited the town orphanage. She went quietly, without her name, bringing blankets, books, and the kind of presence that doesn't command, but comforts. The children never knew who she was, only that she smelled of roses and sorrow, and that she listened. Mr. Beaumont rebuilt the family. Business, but this time not for profit. He funded schools, rebuilt farms, and paid debts of men who had once worked under him. He no longer sought applause. He sought redemption in the shape of usefulness. One evening, Maria was closing the curtains when Eleanor entered the room. Neither spoke. They had learned that silence, when shared with honesty, says more than words. Eleanor held out a small envelope. "For you," she said. Maria hesitated. "What is it?" "A letter of recommendation." Eleanor smiled softly. "For the head mistress position at the new children's home." Maria's eyes widened. You think I could—" "I don't think, Maria," Eleanor interrupted gently. "I know." For a moment both women stood still, mirrors again, but no longer of pain. Now they reflected strength, light, and the quiet beauty of having survived. Maria took the envelope. "Thank you." "No," Eleanor whispered. "Thank you." That night, the red swing swayed under the moonlight, the ropes creaking like an old lullaby. The mansion, once cold marble and pride, now breathed like something alive, a home reborn from truth. Daniel slept peacefully, clutching the small wooden toy Maria had carved for him. His dreams at last were gentle. And in the hall, near the old portraits, Eleanor stopped to look at one, herself younger, dressed in white, smiling a smile that now seemed almost cruel. She touched the edge of the frame, then turned away. That woman no longer existed. Downstairs, Maria stood by the kitchen window, watching the stars. The world outside was quiet, the sky wide and forgiving. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel small beneath it. She felt seen. Forgiveness, she realized, doesn't erase the past. It redeems it. It turns scars into proof that love can survive anything. And as the clock struck midnight, the house settled into peace. No ghosts, no echoes, no regrets. Only the soft breathing of lives finally free. Morning broke over the Beaumont estate like forgiveness made visible. Golden light spilled across the red swing, painting the ropes in honey and the air in peace. The grass shimmered with dew, and the roses leaned toward the sun, heavy with new blooms. The house, once haunted by whispers, now hummed with quiet life. The sound of coffee being poured, a window opening, footsteps without fear. Maria stood by the garden, her apron pale against the morning light. She had not yet left for the children's home. Her first day would begin after breakfast, but for now, she simply watched the world she had helped heal. Daniel ran barefoot through the grass, chasing the breeze, his laughter rolling through the air like a song the house finally remembered. When he reached the swing, he turned to her, smiling. "Push me, Maria." She smiled back. The ropes creaked as she pushed gently, each motion steady, loving, eternal. The boy's laughter mixed with the whisper of the wind, and for a moment, everything, every wound, every tear, every wrong, seemed to make sense. At the upper window, Eleanor watched. Her hands rested on the sill, the light tracing the faint lines of her face. She no longer hid from the sun. She no longer hid from herself. When Maria looked up, their eyes met. And in that still second, something unspoken passed between them. Not words, not even forgiveness. Just understanding. Eleanor placed her hand over her heart, then nodded once, slowly. Maria nodded back. It was enough. Inside, Mr. Beaumont walked through the hall with a cup of coffee and a tired smile. He paused by the portrait of his family, now dusted, polished, alive again, and quietly turned it toward the morning light. In the garden, Daniel jumped off the swing and ran toward the roses. He picked one, soft, red, trembling, and brought it to Maria. "For you." She knelt to take it, her eyes filling with a warmth too deep for tears. The boy smiled and said, "Mum says flowers grow better when people are kind." Maria didn't correct him. She only whispered, "She's right." The wind moved gently through the garden, carrying with it the scent of roses and renewal, and somewhere, in that vast golden air, you could almost feel the universe watching, not to judge, but to witness. Forgiven and forgiver, mother and heart. And as the camera of destiny pulled back, high above the green garden, the mansion, the red swing, the world seemed to pause, listening to the quiet truth whispered beneath the sun. Even the coldest heart can bloom again when touched by the truth of love.